In this tutorial, let's look at Spring MVC. This assumes that you have already set up Tomcat and deployed a very simple Java web application. So it's called a simple web. If you haven't, see the link below and you have to go through the tutorial first. Once you have created a simple web, in this tutorial we will see how to introduce Spring MVC, which is a very popular MVC framework. MVC stands for Model View Controller. So if you look at the simple web that we have already developed, and in this tutorial I'm going to go into the pom.xml file first. Click on the pom.xml here, and in addition, so we have already had JUnit and also we had servlet, and servlet, in addition to that, we need to add the Spring Web MVC dependency. So the group ID is org.spring-framework and artifact ID is spring-web MVC. So if you want to see, I can copy this org.spring-framework and then go to Maven search repository, search.maven.org. Here my group ID is G. I type in the group ID, which is org.spring-framework. I search, and you can see there are so many Spring. You got Spring Transaction, Spring AOP, aspect-oriented programming, Spring Test, Spring JMS for Java messaging service. You got Spring Web. Spring Web MVC will be on the next page. So if you know it is Spring MVC, Web MVC, then I can say A for artifact ID, colon, Spring Web MVC. And this is Spring MVC, Web MVC, and version is 439. So we need to add that to the pom.xml file as a dependency, 439 release. And that's all you need to do to bring in the Spring jar files. So once you add that and update it, if you look at the Maven dependencies, the Maven will go and fetch all the other recursive dependencies. For example, Spring Web MVC needs Spring Bean, Spring Context, Spring Core, Spring Expression, Spring Web, Spring AOP. So everything is recursively brought in. So now we got all these required jars, and also we already know this pom is a WAR file. So basically Spring will build up a web archive file that can be deployed to Tomcat, and you can execute your MVC programs. And now before we go into detail of the main key classes, once you have got the Spring framework, I need to go through the Spring MVC framework itself. So in the Spring framework, what happens is you have a client browser. So client browser will be making an HTTP request. When an HTTP request is made, you'll be making a URL call. So the HTTP request will first look at once the HTTP request hit the Tomcat server. So the whole WAR file, so just imagine that the whole thing inside here is as a web archive file, and it is deployed into the Tomcat server. So the web.xml file is a deployment descriptor. It will inspect the URL, and any URL that says has /entry will allocate to the Spring's dispatcher servlet. So anything in green here are Spring classes. Anything in this yellowish color here, this one here, the model, and also the view are the ones that we'll be defining in our project. So this is a front controller design pattern. So everything goes to the front controller, and then we would have mapped the entry, anything in the URL with the entry, to the dispatcher servlet. And then the dispatcher servlet will make use of a handler mapping. And handler mapping is generally, you can do it through the application context.xml file, or you can define Java config files, and anything with a /myc in the URL path will be mapped to the example that we are going to look at. Is called the simple controller.java. So this is a controller. You can have as many controllers as you want, one for login, one for logout, one to do a certain functionality. So a typical Spring application will have hundreds of different controllers like this, but there will be only one dispatcher servlet. So the handler mapping will look at the URL pattern and then it will allocate to the right. So if it's something with login /login, it knows it has to allocate it to the login controller. So in this case, it comes with /myc, and we allocate it to the simple controller.java that we will be defining in our project. And the controller, this is a very trivial application. So it's going to basically create a model map, which is a model. So model is like a data. So it can be an employee class, person class, or whatever. And in this case, we are going to just put a model map, which is like a key value pair. We put a key in, we put a value in with a key, and then so that we can retrieve that in the JSP or a view later on. So controller will create the model, and then it will say output to a certain view. So in this case, we are calling output.jsp via output, and this will go back to the front controller. Then front controller will look at the view resolver, and the view resolver will decide, because it says output here, it will go to the output.jsp, and when it goes to the output.jsp, the JSP basically gets converted to a servlet. And the servlet, what it will do is it will write out.println a lot of the HTML code. So then your HTML code will get sent back to the browser. So there's a request came in, it goes through all these paths, and then eventually a response goes back. The request can be a form, or it can be just a URL. So that's how you call a RESTful web service. Another important thing to understand is the view resolver will decide. You can configure via your application context.xml or some kind of a Java configuration that Spring allows you to use to decide what kind of viewing technology you want to use. In this case, we are using JSP, but you are not restricted to using JSP. You can use velocity templates, you can use TimeLeaf, and so on. So that can be configured in the view resolver, and this can be done via the application. In this example, I'm going to use it via the application context.xml file. And the controller has already set up a model value that view needs it. So once dispatcher allocates the stuff to the view output.jsp, and output.jsp can go and fetch its variable from this model. So that's what is called the model view controller, MVC. So this is a web design pattern, and this model view controller clearly separates the concerns. The view is responsible for displaying the output, producing the view. The model is responsible for storing the data, and the controller is responsible for tying up the model and the view and the together. And also, in a typical application, in a typical industrial strength application, the controller will be making use of a service layer, and the service layer will go to the data access object layer, DAO layer, and it'll be using something like JDBC or Hibernate, and then going to the database, retrieving some data, and then populating an employee object or a user object or a login object or whatever, and that becomes your model. And also, if you're submitting a form, that form data that you put in gets translated into a model into the controller. So that's a model that's coming in, and then, for example, you'll be getting username and password, and then that'll be mapped to a form, and that from the form you will get the user ID and password, and you go to the database, validate it if it is a valid user and he or she is able to access a particular page, and then you say success or false and set it into the model, and then the view can come and look at it and say get the value and say whether your login is successful or not. So that's why it's clearly the model view controller. They are loosely coupled and each one of them has their own responsibility. Controller is responsible for accessing the data and setting up the model, and then so that the view can later on access the data, the model that was set up, the data that was set up by the model, and then display the output. Now we will look at this in detail in the code. So let me close all these first, file close all. So we have already looked at the pom.xml file that has brought in the Spring dependency, and then this Spring-WebMVC has gone and brought in all the other related dependencies in the Maven dependencies project. You can see it. Now we will look at the controller part. So firstly we will look at the web.xml file. So if you look at the web.xml file, so web.xml file will be always in the source main web app. So this is the Maven structure. Your Java classes will go into source main Java, your properties files and all the resources will go to source main resources, and all the web application related stuff will be going into source main web app. And all the web app will have the webin folder. Webin folder is a private folder. So anything inside the webin folder cannot be directly accessed. But anything outside the web-in folder like index.jsp can be directly accessed via the URL. Okay, so now we look at the web.xml file. This is a deployment descriptor, and this is what is going to hit first. And anything with the entry /*. So here if you look at it, we will be setting up the dispatcher servlet, which is nothing but a Spring class. So it's called the org spring framework.web.servlet.dispatcher servlet. And then it takes an init parameter. Servlets can take init parameter, and it is saying a context config location. So this is an application context.xml. This is a Spring configuration where you define the Spring beans and any kind of annotation driven beans and so on. Then we are mapping this particular dispatcher servlet, which is a Spring dispatcher servlet, to a URL pattern of /entry/. So any URL that comes with /entry/* will be served by this dispatcher servlet. So I could have even left it as just /. That means everything that's coming in will be served by that particular dispatcher servlet. And also it's important to understand there's under webinf, there's an application context.xml. This is where you will be defining the view resolver and some kind of a configuration to say handler mapping, how the handler mapping is going to work in conjunction with the controller. So we will look at the application context.xml next. So that will be bootstrapped via the web.xml itself. So if you look at the application context.xml file, firstly it's saying component scan. So it scans for the components, where to look for the controllers. So you define a base package for all your controllers. So here the base package is com/mytutorial_controller. So what Spring is going to do is, when the request comes in, is going to scan com/mytutorial_controller for all the controllers. So all the controllers here is going to scan that particular package. That's a base package. You can have subfolders under that. It's going to scan all the subfolders inside that. So that's how it's going to do the handler mapping through that application context.xml. And then also we define a view resolver. So in our case, the view resolver is basically, we are saying we are using one of the Spring's classes, which is a internal resource view resolver. Then we are saying we are going to put all our views into this private folder /webinf. If you put it outside the webinf, you can easily access it. You don't have to come through all the Spring classes and the controller and so on. You can directly call index.jsp from the URL itself. But in this case, we want to protect our views. We don't want direct access to the view. So you should come through the controller, and you need to make sure that user is authenticated and so on, and then pass it to the webinf views. So inside the webInf views, we are going to define our JSP pages. So that's going to represent our views here. And then it's saying our views, because I said before, the view resolver can use different technologies. It can be JSP, it can be TimeLeaf, or it can be velocity templates and so on. So in this case, we are saying our suffix is .jsp. So it's saying look for .jsp. So if something called output is a view, so if controller says send it to output, automatically the Spring, the front controller, the Spring dispatcher, the front controller dispatcher will say output.jsp, will append the JSP to it. So that's all we have got in the application context.xml file. Now let's go and see how the controller class is defined. So this is the controller. In this case, we have something called a Spring Controller Java. The Spring Controller Java. So if I go to the source main Java, so this is a Java file. This will be inside the source main Java. So if I go to my controller, simple controller. So if you look at the simple controller now, the Spring controller is saying anything with MYC. So it knows how it has to come to simple controller because we have set the base package to scan for. It will scan for this controller package and it will find the simple controller. Then anything with my MYC / so anything that has got /entry / myYC will come to this simple controller. And also it is important, that's a request mapping. So this is a request path mapping. And also you need to annotate it with that controller, so the Spring knows that it has to look for the class is a controller. So, and then inside that I've got two methods. One, I haven't put any extra mapping, so anything you call with /entry / myYC, it's going to come in with this method as long as it's a get method. So in HTTP there are different methods. You got a get and also you got a post. So if you have forms with fields like login name and password, then there will be a post request you'll be sending. In this case, we are going to just call a simple URL and it is going to be a get request. So once you get the get request, there are different types of models we can use. In this case, we're going to use one of the Spring classes, which is the model map. You can think of it as a key value pair. So you can put a key and a value and then you can retrieve it on the JSP page with that key. So in this case, it's a very simple. We're going to hard code. We say model.add attribute. We're going to select a key called model value. You can call this key anything, key 1, key 2, person 1, person 2, whatever. And we're going to pass a value of simple Spring 4 MVC. So we're basing say Spring 4 version and MVC, model view controller. And then saying we're going to return the output to the output. So the resolver will say, oh, okay, the suffix has been set up here to use output.jsp. So anything, and then it will pass it to the webinf.views and look for the output.jsp here. And the second one here, another method, and we got to call whatever the web.xml file is with the entry / myC, and then if you put something called simple again, then this method will get called. So if you don't put simple again, then this method will call. If you put, in addition to that, you put simple again. So this is what we call the request mapping. So it's looking at the URL, URI, and it's deciding sort of which method to call. And this is also very simple. Same, we're setting the model, putting a key in, and we are slightly putting a different value. The only thing is here we're calling it simple again. So this is an additional value here again. So now that our controller is done, and then only thing is remaining is, in this case we are not using any special model object like employee or whatever, because it's a very simple application. We are using like a hash map like model class. So this is basically the model with the name value pairs or key value pairs, whatever you call it. Now here we said we have configured it to be webinf view. So inside that there should be an output.jsp for this to go. So here if you look at the webinf, so it's in source main web app. Under that the webinf is a private folder. Under that you have a view subfolders where you will have all views, and you click on output.jsp, which is a very simple JSP. It's got HTML, head, whatever, simple page, title, and then it output, which is just a hard-coded static value, and this is the model value that we set it in the controller. So we got to put a dollar and 2 curly brackets inside that, the model value. So this model value will be whatever the value we set it here is, either this value depending on which URI you are calling, or this particular value with the again. So that's all basically in this particular thing. Now we have to run it. So now we have got all the classes we have looked at. Now let's see how to run it. So in one of the previous examples, I've showed how to run it outside Eclipse and also to run it inside Eclipse. So first we will try to run it inside Eclipse, and then we will run it outside Eclipse. So now to run it, it has already built it. So here all you have to do is right click on it and you say add project, and you can add this simple web into this. I've already added it, but here it's showing I need to just republish it because it's not up to date. You make some change, you need to republish it. So you right click on it, and also it's stopped and requires republishing. I right click on it and I say publish. Now it says synchronize. That means whatever in here, it's synchronized with whatever the Tomcat, what's in the server. Now I'll go and start the server. So server is starting up. So while it's starting up, I'll go and open a new browser. So I know localhost, Tomcat is running on my local machine, localhost 8080 is the port the Tomcat is running on. And then this application that we are working on, and then the WAR file we are building it, is called the simple web. So simple web is the context. So everything initially starts with the context. So that, in other words, is just kind of an application name. So I have to put simple web first. Then now if I hit here enter, I need to make sure my Tomcat server is started. Yes, it started. See, if I do simple web, that's a context, and then you can see it prints hello world. This is where it's actually coming from the index.jsp. So when you create a simple web application with Maven, you always come up with a simple index.jsp, and index.jsp does hello world. So this is not protected because I can directly hit it. So if you directly, so this is same as calling index.jsp because that's a default. So you get the hello world. Now if you want to get one of our controller methods to be called, so I'll go back into the simple controller. You can see that in the web.xml file we put entry. So I need to first put the entry in here. So anything with entry will be mapped to the Springs dispatcher servlet. That's how we have configured it in our web.xml file. And then once that is done, it will be going into our simple controller. So because in the application context XML file we said scan all these base controller package classes, and if it finds anything with myc, then it will be going into the simple controller. So I need to put myc here, and then if it is just myc / it's going to call this method. So let's hit enter and refresh this. Here we go. So now we get output simple Spring for MVC. So this output is coming from output.jsp, this output here with the colon, and then whatever the value the controller has set it in the model, which is simple Spring for MVC. Now if I want to hit this method, in addition to that, I got to call simple again. So I go in here and type in simple again. Now you get an output. See, you can see simple again from Spring for MVC. So this is all coming from the JSP, and the model value was already set. Now, one of the key things when you're working with web application, it doesn't matter whether you use Spring MVC for RESTful web service and using AngularJS as a front end, or whether using Spring MVC itself. If you are using Firefox, then you're going to click and then you say Developer Tools, and you open up a debugger. So when you open a debugger, it'll bring something like here. So we can inspect any elements if it is in HTML, forms or whatever. And also another handy thing is you can click on the network. So in the network, and you click on this and you can see what kind of calls are going out. So you can see here, we are making a get call, and it's called simple again to the domain called localhost 8080. So this request will hit the Tomcat, and Spring will work it out which controller to call and which view resolver and which JSP page to output to. And it is important to understand that when JSP page outputs it, this JSP is going to get converted to a servlet, and servlet is going to put all the out.print.line, everything with the HTML head and all those things that are required, and also is going to resolve this value, and whatever gets sent from here, so view JSP, and whatever gets sent from here over the network is an HTML. That's what comes back. So you get an URI that you're hitting, that goes in, and you get an HTML with the response come back, and that's the response. You are seeing it here. So if I go and click on this document, I can see the full URL that's being called, and it's a get method, and 200 is HTTP status code. 200 means it's a success. We got a response back, and then you can see all the response headers that have come back is a text HTML that is sent. So basically whatever comes back doesn't have to always be HTML, it can be JSON. So when you're working with RESTful web services, you'll be making use of JSON a lot. So JSON will be coming back and it'll get rendered into the browser, and it can be PDFs and so on. So this will define the MIME type, content type text / HTML in this case. And also you can see the response. So there are cookies. This is the headers tab. So if you want to see what has come up in the response, you can click on the response tab. So this is the output. We have got it on the response when the response came back. So the request is nothing but the URI that we hit here with that. That's the request. That's all. And the response is the whole HTML page that has come back. And everything that we have covered step by step, there's a link below that takes you through in a post, in a blog post. And also you will see links to a number of video tutorials to set up Tomcat if you haven't already done so. So that's all for this simple Spring MVC, and we will cover more Spring MVC in the later tutorials.